The WNBA is supposed to be in its golden era right now. Record viewership, expanded media deals, cultural visibility it has never had before in its entire existence, merchandise flying off shelves, mainstream sports media actually paying attention. By every commercial metric that a professional sports league uses to measure its own health and momentum, the WNBA should be celebrating. Instead, it is answering for one of the most damaging public relations crises in its history. And the worst part? It did this to itself. What has unfolded around Caitlin Clark and the Alyssa Thomas incident is no longer a women's basketball story. It stopped being that the moment Stephen A. Smith started dedicating airtime to it. It stopped being that the moment Fox News analysts started weighing in. It stopped being that the moment commentators who have spent their entire careers covering the NFL and the NBA started asking the same pointed, uncomfortable question on national platforms. The question that now sits at the center of everything. Does the WNBA actually protect Caitlin Clark? And does the league even care? Those two questions are now in the mainstream conversation permanently. And the answers the league has provided, through its actions, its suspensions, its officiating record, and its institutional silence, are not the answers a league in its supposed golden era should be giving. Let's go back to the game that cracked everything open, because the details of what happened matter more than the headlines suggest. Indiana Fever versus Phoenix Mercury, a competitive WNBA game by every measure. And then a sequence occurs that doesn't belong in professional basketball at any level. Alyssa Thomas, a veteran player, makes contact with Caitlin Clark's throat in a manner that the league itself would later formally classify as reckless. Not incidental, not a basketball play gone wrong in the way basketball plays sometimes do. Reckless. That is the league's own word. What makes the moment worse, and what turned it from a concerning incident into a full-scale institutional flashpoint, is what the footage actually shows. Thomas does not fall the way a player falls when they're going down trying to brace themselves. Physics doesn't work like that. When you're falling, every instinct in your body tells you to spread your hands, protect your face, brace for impact. Nobody, and the commentators who covered this were direct about it, nobody falls knuckles first into another player's throat by accident. That is not how human bodies work when they're going to the ground. The commentators on national television said exactly that. They showed the footage, they broke it down, and even people who admitted they had never watched a WNBA game in their lives looked at that sequence and understood immediately what they were seeing. No foul was called on the play in real time. Let that sit for a moment. The contact happened, Clark went down, her throat took the hit, and the officials on the floor, whose job it is to protect players from exactly this kind of reckless physical conduct, called nothing. The game continued as if it hadn't happened. The league reviewed the incident afterward and issued its response, a flagrant 2 upgrade and a 1-game suspension for Alyssa Thomas. The league acted. That part is true. But the response that was supposed to close the story became the new story, because a 1-game suspension for reckless contact with a player's throat, for conduct the league's own classification system labeled dangerous and non-basketball related, did not satisfy anyone examining the situation carefully. And the people examining it carefully now included some of the biggest voices in American sports media. Here is where the situation transformed from a WNBA controversy into a national institutional crisis, and it happened faster than the league's communications infrastructure could process. The voices who entered this conversation were not WNBA specialists. They were not women's basketball insiders with deep institutional knowledge of the league's history and context. They were mainstream sports commentators whose audiences number in the millions, people who cover the NFL draft and NBA trades and major college football, people who have spent decades building platforms that reach deep into the mainstream American sports-consuming public. And all of them, from different directions, converged on the same conversation. Stephen A. Smith went on air and delivered a monologue about Caitlin Clark that cut right to the institutional core of the problem. He wasn't discussing the 1-game suspension in isolation. He was asking the larger question about what the WNBA is doing with the commercial opportunity Clark has handed it. He invoked Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and Michael Jordan, not to compare their skill levels, but to make a point about box office gravity, about what it means when a player arrives who moves the needle in a way no one else has, about what a league is supposed to do when that player shows up. You ride that wave. You protect that wave. You do not let resentment and roughhouse tactics compromise the health and availability of the player who is generating everything the league is trying to build. His words were direct, they were pointed, and they reached an audience that dwarfs the WNBA's existing viewership many times over. Fox News analysts covered the story. That alone tells you everything about how far outside the WNBA's normal media ecosystem this situation has traveled. Fox News does not dedicate airtime to WNBA regular season officiation controversies as a matter of standard programming. The fact that they did tells you this story had broken through into a different category of public attention entirely. Commentators who opened their segments by saying they had never watched a WNBA game were spending significant broadcast time analyzing what happened to Caitlin Clark's throat and questioning whether the league's response was adequate. When your story is being covered by people who openly admit they don't follow your league, you are no longer managing a sports controversy. You are managing a mainstream public perception crisis. And those are two completely different problems, requiring completely different institutional responses. What the mainstream commentators were reacting to was not just the Thomas incident in isolation. It was the pattern, the documented, cumulative, season-long and career-long pattern of physical conduct directed at Caitlin Clark that the officiating standards of professional basketball have consistently failed to address in any proportionate way. From the earliest moments of Clark's professional career, the evidence has been building. She has been the player who absorbs the most physical engagement on the court. She has been the player whose defensive matchups have consistently produced contact levels that, applied to comparable situations involving other players, would generate foul calls at a much higher rate. She has been the player who navigates a competitive environment that is, by documented evidence across multiple game sequences and multiple seasons, more physically hazardous for her than the officiating framework of professional basketball is supposed to allow. This is not speculation. It is not fan perception filtered through emotional investment. It is the observable pattern that anyone watching the footage across a significant sample of games can identify. And when you add the Thomas incident to that pattern, when you place a punch to the throat in the context of a career-long record of elevated physical targeting, the institutional picture that emerges is not a flattering one for the league that has been presiding over this environment. The one-game suspension Thomas received does not erase that pattern. It does not address the cumulative physical toll Clark has absorbed across 2 professional seasons. It does not change the record of officiating decisions that have applied a different standard to physical contact directed at Clark than the standard applied to comparable contact directed at other players in comparable situations. The suspension was the immediate response to the immediate incident. The pattern that produced the incident remains entirely unaddressed. And then there was the back issue. Clark left the Thomas game with a back issue. Stephanie White, the Fever's head coach, confirmed that Clark would not play in Saturday's game against the Los Angeles Sparks. Long-term health and wellness, White said, was the most important thing. No indication of how long she would be out, treatment during the week off, get her healthy, get her back on the floor. That sounds measured. That sounds like a coaching staff doing the right thing by their player. But underneath that measured language is an institutional reality that should concern everyone responsible for the health of this league. The player who is responsible for the WNBA's commercial growth, the player whose presence in the lineup is directly connected to the viewership numbers and media attention the league now depends on, left a game with a physical injury produced in circumstances involving reckless conduct by an opposing player. She is now sitting out. And the league, whose officiating environment contributed to the conditions that produced that injury, is the same league now being questioned on national platforms about whether it takes her safety seriously. The footage of what happened after Thomas made contact with Clark's throat became its own separate controversy. And it matters because it is the element that generated the most visceral reaction from the audience that had been pulled into this story. It wasn't just the contact, it was the behavior after the contact, the way Thomas responded, what observers across multiple platforms described as smiling, not displaying visible remorse, presenting in a manner that communicated to everyone watching indifference to the consequence of what had just happened. When a player commits a reckless act against another player, whether intentional or not, the response that follows communicates something about the culture of the sport. A player who immediately checks on the person they made contact with, who displays visible concern, who communicates through their body language that the outcome matters to them, sends one kind of message. A player who walks away without visible remorse, who presents to cameras and observers as unbothered, sends a completely different message. And that second message is the one that traveled across social media, across sports talk platforms, across news segments, and landed in the consciousness of millions of people who had never previously engaged with women's basketball. Commentators called it directly. The phrasing varied, but the substance was the same across multiple platforms. This was not a basketball play, and the behavior after it was not what you want to see in a professional sports environment that is trying to present itself to the world as worthy of expanded investment and attention. The demonstrative behavior dimension is what transformed this from a competitive incident into a sportsmanship story. And sportsmanship stories travel differently than competitive controversies. They tap into something that sports audiences understand regardless of their familiarity with any specific league or player. Everyone who has ever watched competitive sports understands what it looks like when conduct crosses the line. Everyone understands what it looks like when the person who crossed that line doesn't acknowledge it. That understanding is universal, and the WNBA handed that universal story to mainstream platforms with an audience vastly larger than its own. Let's talk about the money. Because underneath every aspect of the situation, beneath the officiating questions and the sportsmanship concerns and the institutional credibility damage, is a financial reality that the WNBA cannot afford to ignore or mismanage. The commercial growth the WNBA has experienced in the Clark era is real. It is not subtle, it is not incremental. It is a dramatic, documented expansion of viewership, media attention, merchandise sales, and cultural visibility that represents the most significant commercial moment in the league's history. Media rights deals have expanded, broadcast partners have increased their investment, merchandise numbers have moved in ways that attracted national business coverage. The WNBA is generating money and attention at levels it has never previously achieved. And all of it, every single piece of that commercial expansion, is inseparable from one player. This is not an argument about the talent or value of other players in the league. This is an argument about box office gravity, about the specific, documented, commercially quantifiable reality that Caitlin Clark's arrival generated a wave of interest, investment, and attention that lifted the entire institutional enterprise. Stephen A. Smith made this argument as directly as anyone. Rising tide lifts all boats. The commercial growth the WNBA is celebrating right now exists because of that tide. And the tide has a name. When the player generating that tide is absorbing reckless physical contact, sitting out games with injury concerns, and becoming the subject of national coverage, questioning whether the league protects her, the commercial calculation becomes very simple and very urgent. If she's not playing, ratings suffer. If ratings suffer, revenue suffers. If revenue suffers, the expanded media deals and the increased investment and the merchandise growth and the cultural visibility all come under pressure. The entire commercial structure the league has built in this era is load-bearing on one player's health, availability, and continued engagement with the product. That is not a comfortable institutional reality, but it is the reality. And the league's handling of the Thomas situation, the one-game suspension that has satisfied almost no one analyzing it seriously, represents an institutional response that does not match the commercial stakes involved. The conversation that is now happening in national sports media about Caitlin Clark's future in Indianapolis is the most consequential long-term dimension of this entire situation. And it is a conversation the WNBA should be paying very close attention to because it has moved well beyond fan community speculation. Clark is in the final stretch of her rookie contract. The theory that she might not remain in Indianapolis when that contract concludes has traveled from message boards and fan podcasts into the analytical coverage of major national sports media. That migration matters enormously when mainstream sports commentators with serious platforms and access to significant sources of information begin discussing a player's potential departure in terms that suggest genuine analytical weight rather than speculative fan discussion. The scenario they are describing has typically already been processed by people inside the situation. The case being assembled in these conversations is not just about the Thomas incident. It is about the full organizational picture that Clark has been operating within throughout her professional career. The coaching situation at Indiana has generated its own sustained national conversation. The documented patterns of decisions involving Clark's deployment, her protection, her organizational environment have been discussed publicly by commentators who are now connecting those patterns to the larger question of whether Indianapolis is a place Clark would choose to build her long-term career. Clark has said nothing publicly to confirm any of this. But the silence of a player who is absorbing reckless physical contact, managing injury concerns, and watching national media debate whether her organization has done right by her is itself a data point that serious observers are processing. What happens at the end of that rookie contract depends on factors that extend far beyond the Thomas game. It depends on whether the Fever's organizational environment demonstrates a genuine commitment to Clark's long-term success and well-being. It depends on whether the coaching decisions, the administrative conduct, and the officiating advocacy that the organization deploys on Clark's behalf communicate that she is valued at the level her commercial impact deserves. It depends on whether Clark concludes that staying in Indianapolis gives her the best chance to compete, to be protected, and to build the kind of legacy her talent makes possible. Every piece of the institutional picture the national media is now painting of the Fever's organizational environment is a piece of that calculation, and the picture is not uniformly encouraging. So where does the league go from here? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the most urgent institutional question the WNBA is facing right now, because the damage done by this situation is real, it is documented, and it is being processed by mainstream audiences that the league needs to retain if its commercial growth is going to be sustainable. The one-game Thomas suspension was a necessary first step. It acknowledged that what happened was not acceptable. It applied a formal consequence. But it has not satisfied the institutional standard this situation demanded. The most prominent voices in national sports media have said so explicitly. The mainstream audience that arrived via this controversy has processed the response and found it insufficient. And the league now faces a choice between two fundamentally different approaches to what comes next. The first approach is communications management. Press releases, carefully worded statements about player safety and competitive standards. Incremental responses that address the immediate optics without confronting the underlying conduct patterns. This is the approach institutional organizations default to when they are trying to manage a controversy rather than resolve it. It is also the approach that will not work here because the audience now engaged with this story is too large, too mainstream, and too sophisticated to be satisfied by messaging that does not match the substance of institutional action. The second approach is genuine institutional commitment. Enhanced penalties for reckless physical conduct directed at any player, explicit institutional communication about the consequences of the pattern that has produced repeated incidents involving Clark, officiating reform that addresses the differential standard the documented evidence suggests has been applied to physical contact involving Clark throughout her career, organizational accountability from the Fever that demonstrates to Clark and to the national audience watching the situation that her long-term health and career success are genuine institutional priorities. The league has a narrow window to demonstrate which approach it is actually choosing. The mainstream national sports media is engaged, the conversation is happening. Fox News analysts and Stephen A. Smith and commentators who never followed women's basketball before are all asking the same questions and reaching similar conclusions. The audience, formed by that coverage, is watching what the WNBA does next, and what it does next will determine whether the institutional damage of this moment is recoverable or whether it becomes part of the permanent record of how the league handled its most important commercial era. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath it all, the thing that nobody in the league's institutional structure should be allowed to avoid. The WNBA is not just managing a player safety controversy. It is not just responding to a bad incident in a regular season game. It is managing the credibility of the entire enterprise it has built around the commercial growth that Caitlin Clark generated. Every media deal, every increased broadcast investment, every merchandise sale, every new viewer who discovered women's basketball in the last 2 years exists within an ecosystem that Clark's presence created. The league benefited from that ecosystem. It promoted that ecosystem. It signed media deals and made commercial claims based on the growth that ecosystem produced. And now, the player at the center of that ecosystem has been punched in the throat on national television, sat out games with injury concerns, and become the subject of a national conversation about whether the organization she plays for and the league that governs her competition actually values her safety and long-term career. The unsportsmanship of this situation resonated with audiences who had never watched women's basketball before, precisely because it is universal. Physical conduct that goes beyond competition, targeting that carries a demonstrative edge, a league's response that doesn't match the scale of what happened. These are things that sports audiences across every level and every league understand and react to. And they reacted. The coverage is the evidence. The engagement is the evidence. The fact that you are hearing about this from mainstream voices who cover sports that have nothing to do with the WNBA is the evidence. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Clark has said nothing about her future. The league has issued its suspension and moved forward. The Fever are managing her recovery. The national media cycle continues. But the question that the mainstream sports world is now asking about the WNBA, the question that Fox News and Stephen A. Smith and commentators who never followed women's basketball are all asking, is one the league cannot answer with a press release or a one-game ban. It can only be answered by what the institution actually does in the weeks and months ahead. Does it apply genuine competitive standards that protect all players, including its most commercially significant one, from reckless conduct? Does it create an organizational environment in Indianapolis that gives Clark a reason to build her career there long-term? Does it demonstrate to the mainstream audience that just arrived that this is a league serious enough about its future to protect the player who made that future possible? The national conversation has arrived at the WNBA's door. The most important commercial moment in the league's history is being defined right now, not on the court, but in the institutional choices being made off it. And the audience watching those choices is larger than it has ever been. The only remaining question is whether the people running this league understand what that means, and whether they're going to act like it.